Hi, my name is Richard Azerga from Microsoft. In this video, we're going to look at Microsoft's brand new V2 app model. So the original application model for consuming Microsoft services was heavily separated between consumer services and commercial services, both in how I authenticated and how I called services. They were different endpoints. So if I wanted to build an application and it was going to consume some of the commercial services, I would go to Azure Active Directory, and on a directory, I'd define a new app and give it permissions to things like Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, and all the other great services that are in Office 365. But if I also wanted an application that connected to consumer services, that would have to be a completely separate application definition. I'd go to a consumer area, I'd define an app, and I would give that application permissions to things like Outlook.com or maybe OneDrive. And ultimately, that would be a completely separate application. So Microsoft's new V2 app model is going to unify this experience, both in how I define an application, how it gets permissions to different services, and even in some cases, the service endpoints that they call. So I'm going to go to a single place, define an app, and have one flow to authenticate my users, and then be able to call into different services. And what we're going to use today is the Outlook and Exchange endpoints, which is actually a single endpoint both for consumer and commercial. And we'll see this for more Microsoft services over time, but Exchange is kind of the first to the gate with this new authentication flow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight how the app registration is different, some of the key differences there. I'm also going to highlight some important things around how we do the OAuth flow to actually get tokens and call services. And to do that flow part, I'm actually going to do it without any sort of special libraries like ADAL. I'm not going to use any special frameworks. I'm actually just going to do this completely raw in a browser. And so Rob Howard does this a lot at presentations at conferences, and another friend of mine, Chax, who used to be on the Visual Studio team that's now in SharePoint land, he did a post about a year ago on working with the Office 365 APIs, the raw version. So this is kind of the next iteration of that using the V2 app flows. So we'll take a look at that now. So the first thing in defining a new application that consumes this new V2 app model is to register an application. And we have a nice place to do that. I simply can go to apps.dev.microsoft.com. So you can see that here in my URL bar, apps.dev.microsoft.com. When I go there, not only is the application I end up with going to be unified between commercial and consumer, but even the portal itself where I register these apps, I don't need an Office 365 subscription to actually create apps for Office 365 anymore. I can simply use a Microsoft account like an Outlook.com or Live.com, Hotmail, any of those. I can go define one of these applications. Or if I am in an organization that uses Office 365, I can use one of those Azure AD accounts. So you can see here I can sign in with a work or school account. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll use a work or school account. It's going to bring me into a sign-in screen. I'll go ahead and sign in with an account here. And that will bring me back into where I can define some of these applications. So you can see now I'm inside here, and it shows some of the applications that I've registered in the past. Looks a lot different from both the old ways of registering these applications. So I'm going to go ahead and click this Add a New App button up here, and it's going to just ask me simply for a name. So I'll go ahead and give this a name. We'll call this the App Model V2 application. And I'll go ahead and say Create. This is going to go off and work and define this new application. It's going to be able to be consumed both between commercial and consumer services. Once this is done, there will immediately be a number of differences that you'll notice compared to previous ways of building these applications. So I still have things like an application ID and an application secret. We'll get our secret here in a moment. But one of the interesting things is within one application, I can now manage multiple platforms that it supports. So this is a pretty big change. In the past, if you wanted to build an application that might have a web interface, but also have a native mobile application, you actually had to define two separate applications, right? There was a big difference between what we call a web application and a native application in the V1 app model. Here I can simply define, I'm going to have one that's a web application. It asks me for a redirect URL. I'm just going to give it localhost. And I can also say that it's also going to support a web application. And you can see that it gives me a special client ID here, and a redirect URI has already been defined. So I can actually have multiple kind of platforms that I support in a single application. And so let me go ahead and save this change. The other thing that you'll notice here, there's a lot less fields. There's not near as many fields here to deal with. So if you were to go to Azure Active Directory where applications are defined, there's all these granular things like, is it going to be a single tenant or multi-tenant app? Well, you notice that I don't have that setting here. So everything automatically is going to be supported in a multi-tenant scenario. Now you could certainly code your application to be single tenant, but in general, this flow is going to automatically support multi-tenancy. The other thing is you don't see anywhere where I can define permissions. And that's probably the biggest change we're going to find in this new app model in terms of like the flow for getting access tokens, is that I'm going to actually be able to request permissions on the fly. I'm going to actually provide what we call scoped permissions when I go to get a token, and that's going to allow me to get permissions to what I need. I don't have to set those up ahead of time. And so that's, I think, makes it really nice from a manageability standpoint of the application. So I have this application defined here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the raw process of using this both against commercial and consumer user identities. So I already have an application ID defined here, and I need to generate an application secret. So I'm going to go ahead and generate new password, and that's going to give me a new secret that I can use in my application. So we'll give this just a second. There is my new secret. And so what I'm going to do is I have just a little basically sample. This will be in the blog post that you can use to quickly do the same raw flow for OAuth and call services as I'm doing today. So you can see I have a few things in here. Paste in your client ID and client secret. So let's go ahead and take care of the client secret. Let's just do a replace. So I'm going to replace everywhere that I have paste your secret in with this secret that we have here. So we'll go ahead and do a replace all. The next thing, I'm going to go ahead and take care of that client ID. So we'll go ahead and grab this, and we're going to replace everywhere that we have a client ID. So, by the way, that client secret, it's the only time you ever get to see it is the first time you generate it. So make sure you copy it down. You can always generate a new one, but I can't do anything to see it again. All right, so we'll go ahead and do a replace all on our client ID. And then the last thing that we need to replace in here is our reply URL. So these are just kind of standard parameters that you'd have in an OAuth process. The client ID, client secret, and your reply URL. And our reply URL in this case was just HTTPS localhost. All right, so we have everything we need here. And the general flow for doing a normal user grant here for getting tokens and calling services is going to be just like it has been in the past. In general, I'm going to redirect the redirect the user to sign in, and I'm going to provide a reply URL that when we're done signing in, it will bring us back to that location with a code. And then we'll use that code to get an access token. But there's going to be some key differences along the way. So let's look at this first step. Here's our redirect URL that we're going to actually use in this case. So you can see a few of the parameters are client ID. I have my redirect, My response type is code. And I'm going to zoom in on this here really quickly. So I'll just point that out again. You can see here's my client ID. There's my redirect URI. Here's my response type of code. Now what's not here is my resource. In the past, when I did an OAuth flow, I always provided the resource. Instead, I'm going to just pass in the permission scopes that I want. And the great thing is that the process behind the scenes, Azure AD that's managing this, is going to be able to automatically defer what resource I'm trying to get access to. So you can see here I have this brand new thing that we're calling scopes here. And this scope is going to specify those permissions. So I'm asking for permissions to OpenID, which is just, hey, I want to sign in. And then actually let me scroll over here just a little bit. The other permissions that I'm asking for are things like I want to be able to read contacts. So you can see contacts.read. And then the last thing that I'm asking for is what we're calling offline access. So you can see that right here as I'm tacking on offline access. And what this is in the past, when I did an OAuth flow, I automatically got a refresh token, and that gave me a longer term access to data. Now you don't automatically get an access token, or I'm sorry, a refresh token. So if you want to be able to store a refresh token and give users a longer term access without having to sign in, you can specify this permission scope. And ultimately, the only difference here is when I provide this offline access permission, I'll get a refresh token back. Awesome. So let's actually do this here. I'll go ahead and we'll format this to where I can just paste this in a browser. So we'll go ahead and open up a browser in private mode. And first, let's use an Office 365 account, so an identity that lives in Azure Active Directory. We'll actually do this entire flow a second time using an Outlook.com account. So let's go ahead and start. I'll go ahead and paste this in. And what this is going to do, it's going to take me to the sign-in screen. All right, here we go. So we're on our sign-in screen. One other thing I want to point out here that's really important that I didn't point out yet is that if you look at the URI that we're going to, you notice that it's login.microsoftonline.com/common, which means it's multi-tenant, /OAuth2. Here's the key to make this a V2 app is that I'm using the v2.0 version here when I go to my authorize endpoint. So we're also going to use that when we go and get our actual token. But it's important to use that V2. And you can see that here in the URI that we're using here in the browser. If I zoom in, there you can see we have that V2. So that's an important distinction here when we do this. I'm going to go ahead and provide an account. We'll use my, again, this is an Office 365 account, an organizational account. And we're going to go ahead and say sign in. The next step of this is it's going to say that this app model V2 app wants permission to read your contacts, access data anytime, and sign in as you. So that's really important. Those are those scopes that we passed in. So if I go back here, here was, let me just kind of clean this up a little bit. Here was our scopes, OpenID, which is sign in, read contacts, and offline access. So that's exactly what it's saying here. Read contacts, access data anytime, which is again going to allow us to get that refresh token, and then sign in. So I'm going to go ahead and say accept, and that's going to bring us to a broken page, and that's just because we're actually not hosting anything on localhost. The only reason we did this was to get this code in our URL. If you look up here in the URL, I actually have a code, and that's my authorization code that I can use to get tokens. So that's the second part of the OAuth flow. The first step was just send the user to sign in, and then we get a code back. Now we're going to do that second part, which is to use this code. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the code because we're going to use that, and it also has a state ID that I don't need. So let me go here and just grab just the code. There we go. And I will go back to my notepad, and let's paste that into the second part. So the second part is I'm going to post to a token endpoint. Now again, it's going to be v2. You can see I'm using a v2 here, so it's login.microsoftonline.com/common/OAuth2/v2/token. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to post in a bunch of additional information. Now, again, the information that I'm going to post is very, very similar to what you posted in the v1 app model. So I'm going to have things like my redirect URI. Actually, I'll zoom in on this. I'm gonna basically say my grant type is an authorization code. I'm gonna have a redirect URI, client ID. There's where my secret gets put in here, right? I have my secret. And then I'm going to provide that code that we just got along with the scope. So I'm gonna pass the scopes again. I'm gonna say, hey, here's the permissions I want access to. And so again, that's going to defer the resource that we're trying to use. The Azure AD is going to be able to determine that. So let's go ahead and zoom out and let's paste in our code. And let's go ahead and do this. Now, for doing a post, I'm going to use Fiddler here. So I'm going to open up my Fiddler and I'm going to use the Composer tab. And so let's go ahead and put some of these parameters in. So I'm going to post out to this endpoint. So we'll go ahead and put that in the address. I'm going to perform a post, so I need to make sure I change that. I'm going to specify that we're posting a URL encoded form here, so I'm going to change the content type. These are basically headers that I'm passing in. So I'm going to go ahead and put my header in here. And then finally I can put my body. So let's go ahead and put this body in here. So again, we have all that information, the grant type, the redirect URI, the client ID, client secret, the code, and those permission scopes, which is OpenID, read calendar, and offline access. So let's go ahead and perform our post. I'll go ahead and do an execute. And there it's back. If I double click on it, you can see we got all the information we wanted. We got our access token, and we got our refresh token. So because I specified that I want to have offline access, we're getting a refresh token. But that, again, in this v2 model, that won't be there by default. You have to explicitly say you want a refresh token. Awesome. So let's now take our access token, because that's really the key to getting data, is using this access token. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that, and we'll do the final part of this, which is actually getting data. So to get data, we're going to actually go and perform a get on contacts. So you can see I'm using outlook.office.com/API/v2, or I'm sorry, v1/me/contact. So that's just the endpoint to get some contacts back as OData. Now for headers here, we're going to accept application JSON. That's what we're going to put in for the headers for both the accept and content type. But we're going to specify, and this is the key to making everything happen, is the authorization bearer, is we're going to put the access token from the previous step. So we got that access token back. Let me just zoom out here. Here's our access token that we got in Fiddler. We're going to paste that into our as our bearer token here. So we'll go ahead and paste this in. It's pretty long, and I'm going to clean it up just a little bit. It has the property value. So let's go ahead and now perform this get. So let's go back to Fiddler, and I'm going to use the Composer. We'll change the address. This time we're going to perform a get. Now it's saying, hey, you can't put a body in a get, so we'll get rid of that. We don't want that body anyway. And now we need to change our headers. So we'll go ahead and come back here. And the important thing here is that we're asking for JSON, and we're passing our access token in the headers. So we'll go ahead and put that here in our headers. And I'm going to go ahead and perform our get. So I'll go ahead and say execute. And there it is. We got our data back. And if we were to look at our JSON, you can see that I have an array of contacts. So I have a whole bunch of contacts here. We can go look at all the details. I'll look at this one. Looks like this is Sonia Kopteev. If I were to come up here, this one's Jeremy Thake. So I have all these different contacts that I was able to get back using the new v2 model. Now, this was using a commercial account, using an Azure Active Directory identity. Let's try the same process, but do it with a commercial account, using like an outlook.com account. So what I'm going to do is, let's first clear out my Fiddler, And let's close our browser tab, and we're going to do the entire process again. So I'm going to go ahead and open an in private window. And in this case, nothing changes in the first part of this. We're still doing the exact same redirect. Remember, the first step of OAuth is to redirect the user to sign in and ask for a code back. So that's what we're asking for here, is a code. So we'll go ahead and paste this in here, and we should get directed to sign in. All right, here we go. Our sign in screen is loading. Now this time, again, I'm going to provide a consumer account. So I'm going to do deserigaoutlook.com. And as soon as I tab off of this, it's going to say, hey, I noticed that this is a consumer account. I'm going to take you to a special consumer sign-in location. So you can see there, it says it's taking me to a Microsoft account sign-in page. And so here's that sign-in screen. We'll go ahead and provide a password. We're also going to get a grant screen. It's going to ask us to give consent to this application. And you'll notice that it's the exact same permissions. It's just in a different screen here. So you can see that it says we want to be able to connect to this service offline. We want to connect to, view, sign in. So that's the first one here, is sign in. Access your data anytime, which says we want that refresh token. And then access your contacts. So the exact same permissions that you saw before, just in a different screen. This is kind of the consumer version of it. We'll say yes. And again, that'll bring us back to localhost, which won't load, but we should get our code. So you can see we have a code here. It's a little bit shorter than what we had when we did the commercial flow, but in this case, it still works the same way. I'll go ahead and grab it, and we'll use it in step 2. So step 2 is, again, we're going to post to login.microsoftonline.com/common/OAuth/v2/token, and we're gonna post that code that we just got. So I'm going to replace. We have the one from our last flow. We're going to go ahead and paste in our new code here, and I'm not changing anything else. I don't have to tell it that this is for a commercial account or a consumer account. It's just all automatic. So let's go ahead and go to Fiddler, and we'll do our post. So let's go back here. Let me clean this up, and we'll go to Composer. In this case, we're going to perform a post. We'll go ahead and set our headers, which is that we're going to do a URL encoded form. And then finally, we'll post our body in here that, again, has the permissions we're asking for. It has our client ID, our client secret, and the code that we just got. So we'll go ahead and do this and perform an execute. And there you go, we got it back. And you notice that I have both an access token and a refresh token here. And in this case, this is for a consumer account, an Outlook.com account. So, one application definition can now handle both scenarios, commercial and consumer. So I could take this even further. So I can take my access token here, and I can actually call the exact same Outlook endpoint. So again, just based on the token that I provide, Exchange and Outlook is smart enough to know behind the scenes that, oh, I need to go to Exchange Online to get this data, or I need to go to Outlook.com to get this data. So if we were to come back here, I can go ahead and, in this case, I'll put in a new access token. So just update that. And we can go and perform a get on contacts. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. We'll go back to our composer. We'll change our URL. We're going to perform a get. We'll clean out that request body because that was from our last request that we made. And then let's set our headers. Now I'm going to give you I'm going to warn you ahead of time. This is going to fail here. We're going to get a 404 back. And the reason for that is there's nothing that we're doing wrong here. The situation is that Microsoft accounts are going through a migration process right now to support these scenarios, and not all accounts have been migrated. So interestingly, being the evangelist that I am, my account hasn't been migrated yet. And so what it does though is I will get JSON data back that gives me a nice clean fault. And we'll look at that when I perform this. So I'll go ahead and perform our get here. And again, I'm expecting a 404. So we'll go ahead and say perform our get, and it is getting, and there we go, there's our 404. And what I'll show you here in the raw version of this, it says our error code is mailbox not enabled for REST API. And the message, it also gives us a nice clean message that says REST API is not supported for this mailbox. So again, if my mailbox had been migrated, we would be able to go against the exact same endpoint. I don't have to change my endpoint. That's what's beautiful about this, is as a developer, you build an app one way and it works in either the commercial or consumer services. And just proof of that is the fact that we did get our access token back. So the access token is really the key to getting to any of these services. And in this case, the only reason I'm getting a 404 is because my account hadn't been migrated. But we could certainly, this would normally be a successful call. So there you have it. We walked through some of the key differences between the V1 and V2 app models. So differences like the fact that I pass in my permissions on the fly versus defining them ahead of time. Differences like if I want a refresh token, I have to explicitly ask for it. And then other cool things like not having to define multiple applications if I'm going to support multiple platforms. It can all be defined on one single application. So check this out. I personally think this is one of the biggest progressive things we're doing with our APIs in several years, is making this kind of unification between commercial and consumer. And certainly these OAuth flows are powerful, and you can build some amazing applications with it. So check it out, and happy coding.